Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my review of the Sigma 135mm f1.4 DG Art, a bright telephoto prime lens for mirrorless cameras. Launched in September 2025, the 135 1.4 arrives mere weeks after the 200mm f2, and like that lens is available in Sony E or Leica L mounts. Both lenses are absolute bokeh monsters, capable of obliterating anything in front or behind your main subject with a razor-thin depth of field, but their large apertures are equally tempting for astrophotographers, and in this review I'm going to be showing you results from both, along with my usual tests both near and far. But first, are any of you into coffee? If so, do check out my latest channel, cleverly titled Gordon Gets Coffee, where I make videos about great places to enjoy quality coffee all around the world. And that's my advert over, so let's get on with the review. The Sigma 135 1.4 is the spiritual successor to the now discontinued 105mm 1.4, extending its reach while maintaining the bright f1.4 aperture. It's a rare specification, and as far as I can recall, the only other 135 1.4, at least in recent times, was from Metacon ZY Optics, but that model is pretty hard to find. It's manual focus only, and it's quite expensive too. In contrast, this latest Sigma gives you a brand new optical design from its high-end art series, crucially with autofocus, allowing you to easily grab your shot, and it's also comparatively affordable, at least for this spec. Costing around $1,900 or £1,650, Sigma's 135 1.4 may cost around 50% more than their 105 1.4 if you can still find one new, but it is around £1,000 cheaper than Metacon's version. It's also way cheaper than Sigma's 200mm f2, which costs considerably more at $3,300 or £3,000. Perhaps more importantly though, while the Sigma 135 1.4 is of course more expensive than their own 135 1.8, it is comfortably cheaper than the 135 1.8s from the likes of Canon and Nikon, which typically cost around $2,200 or pounds. I do wish Sigma could make versions in these mounts. But it is available for Sony E, and depending where you live, Sony's FE 135 1.8 costs a roughly similar amount, or maybe even a little bit more, but of course is optically dimmer. So Sigma's giving you an aperture that's 2/3 of a stop brighter than a 1.8 model, and at a lower price than the main camera companies. Pretty impressive on paper, so let's now see how it performs in practice. Let's start with the design and build quality. Measuring 112mm in diameter, 135mm in length, and weighing 1.43 kilograms with its detachable tripod foot, it's certainly a substantial lens. Just for comparison, Sony's 135 1.8 G Master measures 90 by 127mm and weighs 950 grams, a 2/3 weight difference that you're certainly going to notice on extended handheld shoots. But the 135 1.4 is noticeably smaller and lighter than Sigma's recent 200mm f2, despite both lenses sharing roughly similar sized front elements. You're looking at the 200 here, which is a little wider but obviously longer, and around 400 grams heavier too. Start handheld shooting with both of these lenses and you'll of course tire much faster with the 200. Like all of Sigma's lenses, the 135 1.4 is built in Japan, and the quality is excellent, including weather sealing throughout and a rubber grommet at the mount. Note that you cannot mount rear filters on this lens. As noted earlier, it comes with a removable tripod collar, and I'm pleased to report it includes an Arca Swiss dovetail, allowing it to slide right into compatible clamps. There's also holes for locking pins on either side of the 1/4" tripod thread. Loosen the locking screw and you can rotate the lens within the collar with markings indicating 90-degree intervals. Although in the absence of actual notched feedback, you're going to need to visually line these up. Loosen the screw fully and you can remove the collar and foot from the lens entirely, although this only saves you about 100 grams. Now I appreciate any weight saving, but I ended up leaving the collar attached for handheld shooting as it can act as a handy carrying handle. The first control ring is dedicated to the aperture, running from f1.4 to f16 in 1/3 stop increments. A switch allows you to choose between clicked or smooth operation. A second switch sets the lens to auto or manual focus, and is flanked by a pair of customizable focus hold buttons. Next comes the manual focusing ring, which, like most modern mirrorless lenses, is motor assisted. It does turn smoothly though, and I found it possible to focus precisely on star points with magnified assistance. At the end of the barrel is a 105mm filter thread, coincidentally the same as the 200mm f2 lens, although both are substantially larger than the typical 82mm filters of 135 1.8 lenses. But just look at that gorgeous front element. Sigma includes a generous cylindrical lens hood that's almost 80mm long by itself, that twists onto a bayonet at the end of the lens with a locking button to release it, but no window to adjust rotating filters. When the hood's fitted, it extends the total working length of the lens to 200mm, but a rubber tip around the front does allow you to stand the lens up securely and safely. The hood can be reversed over the barrel for transportation, and Sigma also includes a standard spring-loaded cap. Before moving on to my tests, a few quick notes on the optical design. Unlike the recent 200mm f2, the 135 1.4 does not include optical image stabilization, so to compensate for any wobbles you're going to need a body with IBIS. And unfortunately, like the 200mm f2, neither of these lenses is compatible with teleconverters. Sad face. And don't forget, if you're using the E-mount version on a Sony body, you will be limited to 15 frames per second bursts with continuous autofocus. Now that's a Sony restriction that applies to any third-party lens. So if you want to shoot sports at 135mm on a Sony body, then their 135 1.8 G Master may be more appropriate in order to unlock those fastest burst speeds. Okay, now for my tests, starting with focusing. I tested the L-mount version on a Lumix S1R2 and S1 II, and here you can see it on the latter in continuous AF mode at 1.4. Now it was actually faster in single AF mode, but it struggled with the bottle in this particular test at close distance. No, I didn't experience issues in day-to-day use though, just in this test. Here's an example of video autofocus on the S1R2 using face and eye detection across the whole frame. There's minor pauses as I change distance and the camera catches up, but it is an unforgivably shallow depth of field here at 135 1.4, and it does give you an idea of the potential for portraits, which I'm going to cover later on. Next, for focus breathing, here manually focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again at f16. As you focus closer, the field of view reduces quite visibly, almost like you're zooming in, before then broadening again as you focus more distant. It's not ideal when performing big focus pulls for video, but it will at least increase the magnification a little bit for close-up photos. Next, for the quality with the lens, focus on a distant subject, and as always I've angled bright and peer here so that details run into the corners. You're looking at the 135 1.4 wide open at 1.4, so let's now take a closer look in the middle of the frame, and that's where I've focused the lens for all of these tests. Here there's a tremendous amount of sharp detail and nothing really to complain about. Closing the aperture one stop to f2 brings fractional improvements to the contrast and the ultimate sharpness, but from this point I'd say you're already seeing the lens operating at its peak in the middle of the frame. Note from f5.6 onwards though, I did notice diffraction slowly creeping in and gradually softening the details, with f11 and f16 in particular losing a lot of quality. So back to the 1.4 sample before heading into the far corner, where I'm barely noticing any difference compared to the details in the middle. Everything here is looking sharp and there's not even much evidence of vignetting or darkening in the corners. I will close the aperture for you though, but I'm not really seeing any significant improvements beyond f2, and again I'd be very happy with the quality from the lens wide open at 1.4. It's already looking like an excellent performer. But as much as I enjoy telephoto landscapes, the bread and butter for a bright aperture 135 is of course going to be portrait photography. So I'm going to start with this shot taken in my garden from a little further away than normal. I'm now actually stood pretty close to the rear wall behind me compared to my typical portrait shots, but even now you can see how the background is still easily blurred despite its closer distance. Meanwhile, taking a close look at the focused areas shows very crisp details around my eyes, while the razor thin depth of field means the focus is already falling off by my ears. Here's another shot from closer range to match the framing of my usual portrait tests. Don't worry, we'll move on in a sec. The background has of course become even blurrier, while even more detail around my eyes has become resolved. My little garden though isn't really showing what this lens is capable of though, so I headed into Brighton for a more distant background. Here you can see some nice bokeh blobs from the harsh reflections on the cars behind me, while the poles on the right hand side have fallen into blur without any distracting busyness. Suffice it to say, the details on my face are also very crisp. Let's now increase the distance a bit, and here you can really see the benefit of longer focal lengths for portraits, easily compressing the scene and delivering plenty of separation. But as importantly, from this kind of distance, which is a bit more forgiving, you'll ensure the sufficient depth of field to keep someone's whole head in focus even at f1.4, while still being able to substantially blur anything in front or behind. Here the poles on the right hand side had the potential to become even more distracting on a lesser lens, but I'm pretty happy with the rendering here. That said, bokeh style is very personal, so do let me know what you think. As luck would have it, I was still testing Sigma's recent 200mm f2 the day before, so here's a shot from the same location for comparison. At 200mm, the narrower field of view effectively magnifies the background, so you're seeing less of it here, and the perspective on the poles does look a little bit different. But these two portraits do actually look quite similar in overall style, so which lens would you prefer to use for portraits? Of course, a 135 1.4 is going to be similar to a 200mm f2 in terms of overall light gathering and potential for depth of field, which makes it all the more frustrating that you can't fit a 1.4 times teleconverter to the 135 and essentially turn it into something similar to a 200 f2. It is important to note though that not everybody is a fan of longer telephotos for portraits. Indeed, the older 105 1.4 will be preferred by some, and I do wonder if this new 135 is aimed as a sole replacement for that model, or if Sigma's in fact also working on a modern 105 to sell as an alternative. Anyway, speculation, Your Honour. So next up, a more formal look at rendering with my bokeh ball test, with the 135 1.4 positioned near to its minimum focusing distance, and that's 1.1 meters. Here, the star on the ornament measures 4 centimeters across to give you some idea of the fairly modest reproduction that's possible with this lens. But even though 1.1 meters isn't particularly close, there's no arguing with those nice large bokeh blobs in the background. These are also looking pretty well behaved with minimal outlining or textures within, and also more uniform across the frame than many large aperture lenses wide open, perhaps a benefit of that longer distance. Close the aperture once stopped at f2 and most of those blobs become more circular in shape while still remaining pretty large. As the aperture gradually closes further, the 13 aperture blades continue to deliver mostly rounded bokeh blobs, which is pretty impressive when others begin to reveal more of a geometric shape. So an excellent result in terms of quality and rendering, although it is important to note that some rival 135s will focus closer. For example, Sony's 135 1.8 G Master will focus as close as 70 centimeters versus 110 centimeters for this Sigma. For my last test, I'd like to take you from near to very far indeed. Here I've pointed the lens roughly towards the constellation of Cassiopeia and made a 1 second exposure at 3200 ISO, of course with the aperture wide open to 1.4. I've tweaked the levels a little bit in Photoshop, but that's it. Now normally you'd use a tracking mount to make longer exposures and then stack them in software afterwards, but here the conditions were working against me, so I only want to look at the actual star shapes across the frame. Taking a closer look in the middle reveals nice sharp dots as you'd hope even with the aperture wide open, but the challenge for this kind of lens is in the corners. So let's now head into them, where you're going to see that the lens impressively continues to deliver pretty well defined points of light, avoiding most coma and other undesirable artifacts. This is excellent performance from a bright aperture telephoto prime, and I suspect it's going to be a popular choice for astrophotographers, just like the 200 f2 has become already. Here's another shot from a different portion of the sky, this time half a second to avoid trails in this region, and again at 3200 ISO 1.4. And again, nice and sharp in the middle of the frame, and only the slightest hint of coma on brighter stars in the extreme corners. Now this is a very tough test for any lens, and the Sigma 135 1.4 has done very well indeed here. Which brings me to my final verdict, during which I'm going to show you more photos taken with this lens. The Sigma 135 1.4 DGR is a tremendous lens, not just one of the brightest 135s to date, but very practical with modern autofocus and delivering excellent quality too. It's 2/3 of a stop brighter than a 1.8 lens and capable of delivering a razor-thin depth of field with dramatic results and well-behaved bokeh. This additional light gathering power and sharp quality into the corners will mean it'll appeal as much to astrophotographers as it will for traditional portraits. Unsurprisingly, it is fairly heavy at almost 1.5 kilograms, and the minimum focusing distance of 1.1 meters is nothing to write home about. I'm also frustrated it won't work with teleconverters, as fitted with a 1.4 times, it could essentially double as a 200 f2. Then there's Sony's restrictions, which limit all third-party lenses to 15 frames per second bursts with continuous AF. That may make their own 135 1.8 more tempting, at least for close-range sports. Plus that lens is also lighter, focuses closer, and in some regions is actually priced similarly. But the sheer quality and competitive price of the Sigma 135 1.4 is very tempting, matching or undercutting many high-end 135 1.8s while capturing more light. I really loved shooting with it and found it a much more practical proposition than Sigma's recent 200mm f2, both in terms of coverage and heft, while coming in at almost half the price. In these respects, it's a relative bargain, and I expect it'll become a classic for portrait photographers. And that's it for this review. As always, if you found it useful, I'd love for you to give it a like and consider checking out some of my other videos. Plus, if you're into coffee, remember you may also enjoy my cafe reviews on my new Gordon Gets Coffee channel. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.